right, welcome back. Here we are back in the basement, blurry creatures. Over the years, we've been doing the show for 5 years. We've been sent a lot of things, Luke. People send us all kinds of sightings, government conspiracy theories, and the term that gets thrown around a lot is PSYOP, psychological operation. Sometimes the good is mixed with the bad and the fake. And maybe the whole point is to design us to be confused. We don't know what's going on. So we need to bring in an expert. We got him on the show today, Jesse Carey from Ironclad, to come in. He's producing a documentary with Sean Ryan and produced it. And you can be a part of that to kind of go through the details. But it's more than just a episode.
Yeah.
This is like you have to devote your life to understanding what a PSYOP is. And Luke and I have debated a lot of off show of like, is that a PSYOP? Is that true? What's going on? And so we kind of understand how hard it is to know what's going on. And with a lot of current events lately, it's getting harder and harder and harder daily to know what's happening, whether it's UFO disclosure, whether it's political assassinations, or all the things that are happening.
Or even social media.
Yeah.
Like, we look at bot farms and bots and the movement of people using AI to prop up narratives or to troll people or to it's crazy. And I think that since most normal people, I think, probably didn't have a grid for this. Maybe until 2020, when people started saying, "Oh, the great red pill," right?
But we believe everything now.
Right? Yeah, that's
the problem.
Well, and that's kind of by design. You know, one of the people we talked to on the series is this guy Chase Hughes, who incredible guy. If you ever check out his content on YouTube, but he's also like a master hypnotist. And one of the things he said is like, the number one thing for suggestibility, to get someone to a position of suggestibility, is to create confusion. Because then once you can create someone to disorient them and refocus their emotional and mental energy, they're they're in a state of hyper suggestibility. And so I think if you look at social media or you look at a lot of what's going on, if the outcome is confusion, negative emotions, and sort of diverted attention, it means someone is trying to potentially use those methods to steer people in directions that they might not be aware of behind the scenes.
Is there a PSYOP involved in almost every major kind of conspiracy theory, you think? Like there's someone that's actively trying to discredit it? For
sure. I think there are, and there's two ways to think about it. Some of it is like a PSYOP sort of by just sort of commercial evolution, like algorithms tend to reward negative behaviors for the sake of engagement. Like if someone's outraged, they're more likely to want to comment or engage, and it sort of self-perpetuates ideas on the margins that can, kind of create outrage and veer further from the truth. But there's also real agencies that are tasked with planting disinformation and misinformation for a variety of purposes, a lot from our adversaries.
Yeah.
One of the things we looked at early on in the series is this book by two Chinese colonels called Unrestricted Warfare. And so and this came out in the 90s. So even before kind of the evolution of what we're seeing on social media. But sort of the premise of the book is the thought experiment of like, if you have an adversary who's militarily and tactically superior, so like the United States was, particularly to like the 90s, CCP, how can you defeat them? And they determined if you can't beat them from the outside, you have to beat them from within. And they developed a lot of these methods that we're seeing right now, whether it's in the normalization of like political violence, whether it's in hyper-tribalism, or the other one too, and this is when you talk about the UFO thing in particular, is they want to erode trust in institutions. So the military, the institution of family, the church, if they can erode away those trusts in any sort of institutions, people get in that state of suggestibility. And that's when you see like the normalization of political violence, or you see people kind of always raging against the things that are actually kind of holding a culture up.
Like social fabric.
Yeah.
So, obviously we've investigated things like the Roswell crash and other things, and some people will say like Project Bluebeam was just to discredit every single actual crash of a UFO. And then some people say there's lizard people controlling the world, and they're pumping the PSYOPs into our brains. So the broad spectrum of what a PSYOP is, I think we can start with maybe the simple stuff.
Yeah.
So there's a crash.
Yep.
In the desert, they say, oh, it's a weather balloon.
Yeah.
And then they have this whole government team that comes in and says a completely different narrative than what was being talked about the day before, where no, this thing actually crashed. We don't know what it was. Apparently, there was beings inside this thing, and then next thing you know, the next day, it's this whole other. Is that a psyop? Is that like orchestrated and kind of comes in and changes the narrative?
I would say no question, and I would say, I would say that just knowing kind of the evolution, and so just a little, if it's okay, like a little background on how those particular psyops that were in the UFO community evolved. Back in 1947 is where we kind of first saw this emerge with a guy named Kenneth Arnold, he was an aviator, he's a pilot, and he was flying a mission in the Pacific Northwest and encountered objects that were flying at just this crazy rate of speed. Stuff that we read about today, maneuvers that we don't have any physical explanation before. And he got very concerned about it, but he's a very pragmatic guy and assumed, we're right when the Cold War is ramping up, that he could potentially have been encountering a Soviet incursion. And so he goes to reporters. He's all fired. You can actually find old interviews with him from back in the day. And around this time, he's trying to get the attention of the press to say, hey, there's something in our airspace that people need to be aware of. Well, not long after that, there's an incident in the Puget Sound where a fisherman sees a large craft like dumping some sort of metallic waste product into the water, and it looks like a flying saucer. And it's a somewhat famous incident in kind of the UFO world. And so this guy recovers some of this debris, which is, potentially from an off-world vehicle, which in his belief, he goes public with it. The people that are investigating call this guy Kenneth Arnold, and they say, hey, will you talk to this guy who had this encounter? So Kenneth Arnold goes to visit this guy named Richard Dahl, and he gives him some of this crash material. Well, around that time, Kenneth Arnold gets visited by kind of mysterious members of the Office of Air Force Intelligence, black suits. This is kind of the original Men in Black. He goes to meetings with these guys, and he shows up to the office the next day. The office is dismantled. He stays in hotel rooms, and his conversations are being wiretapped. Yeah. And so some of this like espionage stuff starts creeping in to this guy who's just a patriotic guy that's like, hey, man, there's something might be in our airspace. So Kenneth Arnold takes some of this debris from this incident at the Puget Sound, and the Air Force at that point says, we want to take this debris with us. And the Air Force had actually just been incorporated like 2 weeks before. They take it, they get on a B-52 to fly it out to a research facility. At takeoff, that B-52 crashes. The two Air Force agents on their fatalities. They're actually the first two casualties of the Air Force. And the UFO material obtained by Kenneth Arnold vanishes, never seen again. And so immediately there's this air of mystery around what he saw and why he had these encounters. So then if you fast forward to 1952, there were 2 weekends in 1952 where there were UFO sightings over military institutions and the White House.
And those videos are crazy.
Yeah. And it's documented. People are freaking out.
Yeah.
They actually have a press conference, and it's the most viewed press conference since World War II.
Wow.
And if you watch it back and compare it to some of the press conferences after like the New Jersey drone incursion, you can see a lot of similarities in messaging. That's around the time that Eisenhower kind of commissioned Project Bluebeam, and he wanted the military to gather intelligence about all of these different encounters. And that's where you see the military openly start talking about planting misinformation within the UFO community to detract from what could potentially be an adversarial incursion, or it could be advanced aviation technologies that they want to protect. It could be something else. And then the most well-documented case, I think, when you look at UFO psyops, is it was near Kirkland Air Force Base, and it first kind of cropped up in 1979.
But real quick though.
Yeah.
So, because our listeners are divided on this, half the people that listen to like a show like ours believe UFOs are the psyop.
Yep.
That they don't exist. They're not even a thing. But when you go into it, the data is older than the technology.
Yeah.
The data is older than holograms. It's older than drones. There's video footage. There's pictures in the late 1800s of UFOs. That is true.
Yeah.
The UFOs exist. What they are, we can debate all day long about that. But just so our listeners are clear, we are saying this phenomenon is happening, and then you have these agencies trying to do PR control of what it is, who's involved. Because I think half our listeners don't think that UFOs are real.
Yeah, they think that Project Bluebeam means that all of these experiences, all these encounters are holographic, and that what they're doing is leading up to some sort of fake alien invasion, or which that could still be on the table for all we know. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't disqualify, as Nate's saying. Maybe this is a question. It doesn't disqualify all of the things before.
Yeah, you have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
Not everything is a lie. There is physical data. This guy's saying, okay, this stuff is being dropped into the creek or whatever.
Yeah.
And we've recovered it. And then the government agencies kind of swirl around the evidence and go, what do we do with this?
Yeah.
And then from there, it's sort of a mixed bag of certain agencies want it out, some don't.
Yeah.
And it requires someone to devote their, make a full-time career out of trying to figure out what's going on with it.
Well, and even then, because even then, that actually is probably the more dangerous route at sometimes, because then a lot of times it's those individuals who are targeted for PSYOPs.
Are you strong enough to outrun a Sasquatch? Better be smart enough. You got to get your mind in laser focus, and Momentous creatine chews will help you get there. They're the easiest strength-boosting routine. Get that mental clarity.
There's like so many more benefits than just working out and like and having sort of the muscle building stuff. It's, it's your brain, it's your energy. Momentous has, a fantastic new creatine chew, bite-sized lemon lime chews that make this routine and rhythm in your life pretty effortless. I really like the flavor, really like the convenience, and I pop these in the morning.
Each chew delivers 1 gram of Creapure, creatine monohydrate. It's the gold standard, single source from Germany, and NSF certified for sport, which means it's independently tested for purity, safety, label accuracy, trusted by Olympic athletes, pro sports teams, and elite military operators.
Yeah, and Momentous spent years testing until they created the first chewable that actually meets the Momentous standard. Uncompromising science, meticulous sourcing, and real transparency. There's no artificial sweeteners, no fillers, just science-backed, clinically proven performance in a portable and craveable format. So whether you're training, working, or traveling, or you just want to feel better. We're getting old, Nate. This is a performance without pause, made to support your body and your brain every single day. Momentous doesn't follow those trends, Nate. They perfect the fundamentals. This is chewable creatine done right. This is the big fundamental, like Timmy Duncan.
You can rest assured there's no sweeteners, fillers, and all the things that you put in the junk inside a lot of these supplements that we get these days. But right now, Momentous is offering our listeners, people out there in the Blurryverse, up to 35% off your first order with promo code BLURRY. Just go to livemomentous.com. Use promo code BLURRY for up to 35% off your first order. That's livemomentous.com. Promo code BLURRY.
When you talk about PSYOPs, you can look at them at different scales, right?
Yeah.
I think what we're seeing today is a lot of like large scale psychological operations meant for mass sort of social engineering projects. But on an individual level, and not to harp too much on the UFO thing, but I think it's prudent to kind of the context of the overall discussion is how the levels that they would go to, even just on an individual level. And this makes me kind of take with a grain of salt some people in the kind of UFO world today. Not that I think they're necessarily have nefarious intentions, but potentially have been intentionally deceived. Mm-hmm. Is there was a guy, he was a Coast Guard veteran, and he lived near Kirkland Air Force Base. And anyway, he started seeing these objects flying over his house in the late 70s. And he started filming them. He was a radio engineer, really brilliant guy. But he was a patriot, and he went to the Air Force Base that was nearby and said, hey, I've been filming these things. I've been seeing these things. And what he was actually seeing was early drone innovation. The Air Force, I don't think people realize how far ahead aviation technology is.
Yeah.
And so what he's seen looked otherworldly, but it was conventional Air Force technology. And so not long after that, these other guys, these sort of a guy who wrote a great book about it named Mark Plinkington calls them Mirage Men, basically real life men in black, started visiting him. And they started projecting. He was a radio engineer, so he had a lot of audio equipment in the home. And they started projecting in what seemed to be intercepted transmissions about a pending alien invasion. This was a targeted PSYOP against just one guy who had accidentally filmed some stuff. He started seeing cattle mutilation start happening around the ranches around his home. So this guy goes to all these conferences, and he's like, you're not going to believe it. I'm working with the Air Force. At one point, the Air Force gives him a laptop, and they say, this contains all the secrets of UFOs. And you can trace back these, this laptop actually had stuff that was suggesting that religious figures, including Christ, was actually, seated by aliens. A lot of far out stuff.
Yeah.
At one point, this guy, Richard Doty, with the Office of Air Force Intelligence, flies him to a site that appears to be like a crash retrieval site, but it's staged in the desert. And this is all part of a campaign just to deceive this guy. He was eventually institutionalized. He did recover, but his family, he barricaded himself in his house with a shotgun, believing aliens were coming. But that's the lengths. I just tell that story because that's the lengths that historically some of these agencies have gone to plant misinformation or to distract people or confuse people that just want to have the conversation.
That's funny because I remember when Diana Pasulka came on, she was saying, maybe I am sort of being used, or maybe I am. What did she say? She said maybe I am a useful idiot or something like that. That was her words of because she went to a crash site and she and a lot of our listeners a mixed review, a mixed bag, and I think that in the middle of even being involved in some of this stuff, some of the people who are involved in it, it's so outlandish and so strange and weird that they don't even know.
Yeah.
Is this happening right now? Am I actually a part of this? Am I helping move this needle forward, or am I pushing a psychological operative? Am I a part of one?
Yeah.
And I think what you're describing is so bananas and bonkers. So it starts with an actual something that they can't control. Then they come in. I mean, we've said the Men in Black have shown up for a couple of people that we've interviewed. Talked about a Bigfoot. The guy shot a Bigfoot, and he said they showed up, and then they knew where it was, and they threatened him, and it's just Sasquatch stuff. And even the Patterson Gimlin film, there was this guy, and they made a suit, and it was all fake. And it seems like any kind of major movement in this space, there's these people that show up. Smithsonian gets the bones, as we say. And there's this whole other narrative that kind of comes in. But the problem is sometimes it's so subtle.
Yeah.
They can project stuff in your mind and get you to believe a whole nother narrative.
And they've been,
it's wild.
There's a guy, Leon Davidson, who he worked on the Manhattan Project. He was really well connected. Yeah. He wasn't like a kook. And I'm not, that sounds pejorative, but you get people who have kooky ideas, but this guy was not someone, he was an engineer and had high level DOD clearance. And you can go find his kind of whistleblowing documents. He wrote a book that kind of got buried, but he had suggested that around the time of MK Ultra, where they're openly testing psychedelics, particularly high doses of LSD, that they were intentionally experimenting with manufacturing supernatural experiences with the use of drugs. This guy, Leon Davidson, actually suggested that they had hired some set designers from Disney to create these crash sites. And they were having people within kind of intelligence and military agencies have these seemingly supernatural encounters. Leon Davidson suggested they were being drugged and taken to a site that looked like an alien crash retrieval, so that person thought that they had an encounter with something supernatural, with aliens, but the real objective was to discredit that person, or potentially whatever they did see or whatever kind of program they had access to. At that point, they mix so much kind of just weirdness in with the reality that it doesn't really matter if the truth gets out there, because it's buried in so much misinformation that it's impossible to discern truth from reality. And when you talk about psychological operation, that ends up what has evolved from sort of the early days of psychological operations, which is kind of straightforward propaganda, to what we're seeing now. That's more of the methodology is creating states of confusion, not just for reasons of suggestibility, but to hide national security secrets.
It kind of feels like trench warfare sometimes, where if you're a podcast or a documentarian or someone, you're kind of in the middle and they're lobbing grenades on both sides, and you just have this small, narrow sliver of trying to get through all the information and not get stuck in one side.
Yeah.
How do you know what's true, what's not true, what's a PSYOP, what isn't a PSYOP, what originally happened, what's being covered up? What's your methodology of figuring out the ground zero of the story?
Well, and that's tricky because like I said, there are agencies and institutions who this is all they do, you know? But we had on that guy, Chase Hughes, who is also like a kind of a human psychology expert. And, you know, he says the easiest way to identify if you're part of a PSYOP is to look at the level of voices that are being intentionally silenced or suppressed. That is usually like a red, you know, kind of red flag. But when it comes to deciphering kind of, we called the episode the signal from the noise, you know, like it's interesting. There was an anecdote, I think it was from Diana Pasolka's interview. It might have been with you guys, where she talks about when she went to this crash site, they had metal detectors, but there was crushed up cans everywhere. And so, you know, there's an idea that before you run like a bombing campaign, they drop like, it's called chaffing, and they drop metal flakes in the air. So that causes radar confusion. But the idea is so that when you fly the bomber through, everyone is, the radar is bouncing off all this metal. Or like in Diana Pasolka's case, you're finding all these tin cans that even if there is the real piece in there, you're not going to find it because all this stuff has been planted.
It's noise.
And that's essentially the method that you're seeing, particularly in the UFO space.
It's really interesting because one of the things that the conversation I had sort of offline with Timothy Alberino, who is in our space, who also I know you're working with on another project, is he was saying that even in our space, like this sort of sort of talking about the fringe things in the Christian space, in this, he believes that there are. This is Tim's. Believes there are plants even in this space to provide disinformation in the Christian sort of paranormal supernatural space in order to discredit the entirety of the information. And that's just Tim's. And I was like, okay, Tim, but to your point, that is noise. And if it's age old, right? It's like the idea of a deception is really like two truths and a lie, or one truth and two lies, right? It's the way that the enemy kind of works, is to. It's enough plausibility or that people accept it. I think just for our listeners, we kind of jumped right in, but obviously working on an audio show. Nate said called PSYOP. We're covering psychological operations, hosted by Sean Ryan, future friend of the show. But you're the director of original content for Ironclad. This is a project, and there's eight episode series coming out where you cover sort of the entirety of historical psychological operations and kind of move us to where we are now. I kind of want to jump back into the UFO thing, because one thing we had talked about pre-roll was the idea that within this UFO, the PSYOPs in the UFO space, they are creating sort of a UFO religion. We've talked about this actually on the show. With Tim, we've talked about this. Even Dr. Michael Heiser, the late Dr. Michael Heiser on the show, would often talk about the UFO religion. He would actually show up and present the gospel at UFO conventions because people were so close and so searching for the truth that there's this tipping point. And I think that's really why, and we've said this before as well, that the ancient aliens thing has caught on for so many people. People so badly want to believe in answers. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And they don't have answers, and the church is not going to talk about them, or the church will just give a blanket answer. It's all demons, and they're like, no, something else is going on entirely. And so that's why we talk a lot about on the show, is like how to think about things. It's like we don't necessarily have the answers, but there's a better way to think about, put it all on the table. Throwing out PSYOPs is a big part of that. You know, Luke, over the years, we've had a lot of strange encounters, but sometimes the strangest encounter happens at the grocery store, and we're here to stop that.
Yeah, you got to be dodging and weaving all the weird people at the grocery store. They're all looking for canned corn, and you're just trying to find some hot sauce.
You want to avoid all that.
That's right. Home Chef is an amazing service. They're partnering with Gordon Ramsay as well. They've teamed up with him to bring 5-star stress-free recipes to your kitchen. You got a busy night, maybe a busy day. Now it's easier than ever to cook like a pro without the pressure.
That's right. Home Chef is rated #1 by users of other meal kits for quality, convenience, value, taste, and recipe ease. And it makes it simple. Food comes fresh to your door. Easy recipes to follow for even people like me that do more than 4 or 5 steps and you get lost. And Gordon Ramsay's involved, Luke.
That's right. Choose from Gordon Ramsay's co-branded dishes featured across Home Chef's culinary collection, classic meal kits, and express options. They're crafted to make you a chef in your own kitchen. So whatever kind of day it is, classic recipes, 30-minute meals, oven-ready trays, quick microwave options, Home Chef has you covered. And it's not one size fits all. There are over 30 meal options per week with choices for different diets and tastes. Plus, it's affordable, Nate. Home Chef customers save an average of $86 a month on groceries.
That's right. And they deliver their kits right to my door. We tried out the meals many times, and it's so good. The meat was great, fresh, tasted good, and it came with some side dishes as well.
I love spicy food.
Yeah.
And they've got an Inferno beef burger right now with Parmesan crisp, tomato bacon chutney, and spicy guacamole. Oh. And it's out of this world, I'm telling you.
For a limited time, Home Chef is offering our listeners, Blurry listeners, 50% off and free shipping for your first box plus free dessert for life. Go to homechef.com/blurry. That's homechef.com/blurry for 50% off your first box and free dessert for life. Homechef.com/blurry, and you must be an active subscriber to receive free dessert.
Yeah, and I think I used to years ago I did a series, it was called Hiding Something, that looked at like kind of the Bigfoot phenomenon, particularly like the David Paulides deal. I became interested in like missing 411. And so but I wanted to approach it like very like journalistically, right? Yeah. And not speculation, just say like, if I were just use deductive methods, what can we find are true? And it was like, well, either the people who've had encounters are lying, which didn't seem to be the case. I mean, you guys talked to a lot of people that have had encounters. A lot of them seem sincere, right? And seem earnest. Then it was like, okay, so it's either they saw something they didn't see or had an encounter they didn't see, or maybe there's this undiscovered primate or whatever. But then especially as I got into more of your show and then really went down the Paulides rabbit hole, it's like, well, maybe it's this third thing. Maybe it's sort of this, whether it's supernatural, sort of what we think of as like angels and demons, maybe there's this ancient sort of element to it. But I think the fourth thing there is the one that is often ignored and not intentionally, I think actually by design. And it's what we're talking about is, are people being intentionally deceived? And are some of these encounters manufactured in order to detract from one of the other three? Mm-hmm. And if so, which one of the other three?
I think, how would they do that?
So for like the UFO encounters, like I said, they can actually, there is like a history of them kind of staging encounters. But like, if you're just talking sort of like, one of the things we talked about in the series is the future of psychological operations, actually something called cognitive warfare. And there are technologies that are being developed right now. And this sounds woo, but I mean, I talked to a commander in the U.S. Navy who's deeply concerned about, active duty. And it sounds like sci-fi, but some of the weapons and technologies that are being developed, they bypass the traditional methods of psychological information, which is basically information warfare. And it's actually more neurological. And so
the tinfoil hat is actually useful.
I mean, I know we're joking, but like, no, there are frequency technologies. Yeah. There are direct energy weapons that can actually plant emotions, thoughts, voices.
Yeah. So just like to start. So there is a Bigfoot. There is a creature. Here's a footprint of one. This is from Bluff Creek, right? This is actually like a Squatch track. But then you're saying some of them are just basic encounters, and then there's weirder ones where like they phase in and out. What is the reason a government or an agency would want to plant a bananas experience inside the mind of somebody?
Well, if I were to kind of speculate, I think personally that
it's a lot.
Yeah, I think truth. It just sounds so cliche if I'm catching myself say it, but truth is power, right?
Yeah.
And I think that I actually think that's a very Christian idea, that the gospel is power, right? But beyond that, just knowing what is real and what's not real is just the baseline. If you look at how powerful institutions have been preserved throughout history, it was through who controlled truth and information. Yeah. I mean, you could look at Galileo or who, even when like the church, the big C church was in power.
Gutenberg.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like any threat to power came through access to truth. So I think if you're kind of speculating, like, there's evidence of creatures that we don't know about, that there's something weird, right?
Yeah.
Whoever possesses the knowledge, it could be advanced aviation technology, it could be whatever it is, it could be reverse engineering programs. Whoever knows the truth holds the power.
Yeah.
And so I think on a very baseline, when you're talking about psychological operations, that's what it's about, right. is preserving that cornerstone of power, which is...
So the way they do that is, instead of going out and dropping like propaganda in newspapers and things, they'll put the propaganda in some Bigfoot enthusiast's brain.
Yeah.
They know he's like a useful idiot. They put this thought, or they have this experience, they project it into him. Then he goes around and tells all the Bigfoot people.
Yep.
and he discredits the Sasquatch, because has this bizarre theory. And so everyone on the outside, normies, are looking at the Sasquatch going, these guys are nuts. This is tabloid. This is bananas. And they can sit back and laugh because they got their own guy to be their own PR agent. They didn't have to do it themselves. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Exactly. And like, look, there are, so this was like in the Washington Post like a couple of weeks ago about a famous UFO incident. But anyway, they had an anecdote in there about people like military officials near Roswell and near Kirkland and these places were given Polaroids of weird looking crafts and were told to go to bars around in the desert area and be like, guys, you're not going to believe what I saw. And they would hang these pictures in the bar. But the idea is to, hey, get them just kind of talking. And all of a sudden, like, oh, I don't know, man, that's just bar talk. Like, I don't know, I saw a Polaroid at,
Yeah.
But the idea is the same in principle, is like, it's a way of kind of discrediting, like, especially since the advent of the internet, it's impossible to keep a secret. Like there are going to, in the Snowden era, like there are leaks. And so I think smart, intelligent people are aware of that. And so if they can't control the leak, they can just leak everything, whether it's true or not, in a lot of cases, to protect what is true. And I think that's sort of the pervasive method of psychological operations, is mass misinformation and real information dissemination, but only certain people know what's real and what's not.
So, but it goes all the way up to like, say, somebody that's super influential, like someone like Tom DeLonge, for example. Like, how does Tom know he's getting the real information, or he's government agencies like, we can tell this guy whatever we want and we can plant, and then he'll go out and tell thousands and thousands of people every night that come to his shows. Tom, come on the show if you want to come on the show and talk about it. But you know what I'm saying? Like that's an influential guy. That's a guy that you would want to control.
Yeah.
And it's really hard for that guy to know if he's being controlled or not. Well, and where's he at, And I think man, we could talk about that whole, because I think they've actually made some fascinating conclusions. But even one of the shows that Ironclad produces, we had on Representative Eric Burleson, who, we asked him about this video that he had shown at a congressional hearing about UAP disclosure. And it appeared to show an object being struck with a Hellfire missile and deflecting it. Yes.
And so our host, shout out to our guy, Andy Stumpf, asked him about it directly. And Representative Burleson, kind of in full disclosure, no pun intended, was like, I can't tell you with 100% assurance that's not AI. I can't tell you. He's like, I'm not even certain it was real. But I felt like I was given the video, I needed to show the American people. So even an elected representative is given something that is played at a congressional hearing. So whether it's Tom DeLonge or whether it's an elected official, I think there are a lot of people that are being fed things for strategic purposes.
So Burleson's interesting, though, because he's a believer.
Yeah.
And he also is friends with some of the folks in our space that are believers and trying to get to the bottom of this UFO phenomena. And talk about it from a standpoint of our faith. Like, it's a lot of what we try to do here.
Yeah.
Like, how do we take this and contextualize it within the biblical narrative? But yeah, interesting. Like, this feels, gosh, like even just talking about this feels like you don't know if anything's true. Right. And so, you do an 8-part series with Sean Ryan and you're uncovering these. I mean, where do you land on this
where
stuff?
do you even start?
Because I think this could be overwhelming to a lot of people listening. Being like, I can't believe anything now, right?
Yeah.
And this is what we talked about pre-roll too. Is that for so many folks, this all becomes a zero-sum game. It's this has to be this, or it's not. It's nothing, right?
Yeah.
It's either like it's Project Bluebeam and it's all fake. There's no nuance to it. Good morning, campers. It's cold outside.
Bigfoot's out there. He's well dressed. Cashmere sweaters, organic cotton tees, and he's just having a real good Pacific Northwest morning, all because he decided to go to quince.com and see what they've got available.
I think it's 26 degrees today here in Franklin, Tennessee. I actually have my cashmere beanie from Quince on today.
Look at that.
And it's keeping me warm. But if you are transitioning into the fall and winter and you need a wardrobe refresh, Quince pieces make great gifts for yourself or for a loved one. This season's lineup is simple, smart, and easy with Quinn's $50 Mongolian cashmere sweaters that feel like an everyday luxury, wool coats that are equal parts stylish and durable. They've got denim that nails the fit and everyday comfort at a fraction of what you'd expect to pay. And they do this, Nate, because they partner directly with ethical factories and top artisans, cut out the middlemen, and deliver premium quality at half the cost of other high-end brands. So you get luxury quality without the luxury price tag. Nate, I've got a number of things from Quinn's, including my son Jack and I have matching Flownet hoodies. You got a watch band for your Apple Watch. And listen, this quality's held up. I've had this beanie for more than a year now. It looks brand new. Feels brand new. So the quality's unmatched, and it's really been a go-to as far as fall outerwear.
That's right. If you have anything you're thinking about this holiday season, categories, think bedding, bath, cookware, travel accessories, all the things. Give and get timeless holiday staples that last the season with Quince. Go to quince.com/blurry for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too, up north. That's quince.com/blurry, QUINCE.com/blurry. Get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/blurry.
I mean, so after doing this series, with Sean writing the series and spending all this time producing the content on psychological operations, like how do you use discernment in your mind? How do you do that? So that because to me, even listening to our own conversation feels overwhelming. Like you can't believe anything.
Yeah,
but there is truth in there. So how do we get down to the truth?
Well, first, I think the first thing is to recognize like the baseline methods of psychological operations beyond just the strategy that they're disseminating information in. The first is, one of the guys we talked to is, this guy I mentioned a couple of times, Chase Hughes, brilliant guy. And I would encourage anyone who's concerned about psychological operations to watch some of his content because he kind of helps people recognize the tools that are used on an emotional level. Because once you're manipulated emotionally, the information's the easy part.
Yeah.
And so the big thing is, he talks about what he calls the fate model. And the first one is fear. And so that you're put in a state of fear. So let's take the New Jersey drone incident, right? That's kind of scary, right? They're over military institutions. There's something immediately fearful about that. The next one's attention, right? And so you'll see all of a sudden it all over social media or all over the news. And so it's fear, it grabs your attention, and then it's tribalism. And this is where, when you look at, you mentioned the Charlie Kirk shooting or, these assassination attempts. When people are in that state of fear, they know their attention is being grabbed. They'll instantly, you can recognize efforts to tribalize people in that state. And a lot of it is artificial manipulation. It's manufactured outrage or suggestive outrage where, someone is saying something outrageous about, the shooter or the motives or to get people in a state of emotion because then they want you to more deeply engage with it. And so when you're looking at just the baseline, if you can recognize those things are happening in real time, fear, attention, tribalism, engagement, that is the red flag.
It just sounds like social media.
Yeah.
I mean, literally that's social media.
Yeah.
It's like, be afraid of this. Pay attention to this.
The algorithm uses that for like a business standpoint, but the same sort of gullibility of a human being existed in the beginning in the garden, the deception of like, it was an emotional appeal. Oh, you don't feel this way. You should feel this way. That's always been sort of part of being a human being is we're emotionally unintelligent creatures. We're not as smart as some of the entities that know how to manipulate us from whether it's a mass perception of like, do this thing for your health, right? Take this medicine because it's going to help you, like on a broad spectrum, and then maybe just like a small little micro. Here's a Polaroid photo.
Yeah,
take it. So it starts small and it goes all the way big. What are the big ones? What are the ones that seem very complicated? Psyops that are like years and decades in the making, with multiple people and institutions and sort of things involved. Because we know the little ones. Oh, this is a fake suit.
Yeah.
It's discredited. And then there's like crazy ones.
Yeah.
What are those ones?
So I think, and this is where it gets like into like the cognitive space. So you can only take some people so far with misinformation, because people, And especially, I think, Christians are taught to pray for discernment and are taught, that is one of the when you look at the end of the book, right? It's like what separates sort of the sheep from the goat ultimately is some had discernment during a time that was literally called the Great Deception, right? Like deception is sort of the end game. So, but I think, there is a limit to it because some people will have discernment to recognize this is real or this isn't. But when we're talking about the craziest stuff, it really is where it's going, in my opinion. And that is, you can only change what people think for so long before you start targeting how they think. And you can see this on a small level of like efforts to rewire people's brains. And, you can do it like MK Ultra did it through drugs. There's its direct energy stuff. But even I take an app like TikTok, right? So TikTok, the version that we have is different than the one that is behind the Great Firewall in China. In China, they get a lot of STEM, like math and science and things like that.
Yeah.
The number one aspirational career for a child in China is to be an engineer. In the United States, it's like influencer and YouTuber.
TikToker.
There's also time limits on TikTok in China. Here, they're having to bring in specialists in a lot of schools because attention deficit is on the rise. And a lot of that is by app design, is that, one thing Chase talks about in the series is this experiment that they did in the 1960s called the smoke-filled room, where you bring in someone, they tell him he's part of this social experiment, and everyone in the room is an actor but him. And as they're filling out...
It's like Jury Duty. You ever see that show on Amazon?
Yeah, exactly.
Unbelievable show, right?
Dude, shout out to that guy, by the way.
That was unreal.
He was the coolest dude. Yeah. Good for him. He came out like a hero.
If you haven't seen the show, it's on Amazon, but like it's a fake selection for Jury Duty, and a guy gets selected, and everybody is an actor. The case is fake, and they do it all in real time.
Yeah.
And he thinks he's really part of a documentary on Jury Duty. Yeah, but
it's like the Truman Show.
Point, though, right? Yeah. That's the...
Well, so they did this same kind of situation, but they wanted to like push people to extremes. And so what they did is they had them fill out paperwork. One guy is not an actor. The room, first they hear smoke alarm go off, and the guy's filling out paperwork and he's looking around and no one's moving, right? And so because everyone around him isn't doing something, he kind of stays in the spot. Well, then they start pumping smoke into the room, okay? And he gets up to leave, and they're like, hey, what are you doing? He's like, well, there's smoke. They're like, well, we need to figure out the paperwork. Time after time, there were people who would sit in that room to the level of asphyxiation because they were, the people who were conducting the experiment controlled the context in which the person was receiving the information. So like the information that the guy received was accurate. There was a smoke alarm. There was a fire alarm.
Sure.
But the context was changed. So when you look at taking that same idea and you put it to like TikTok or something, they don't even need to control the manipulation in which people are consuming it. But if they can destroy an attention span, they can ramp up content late at night to make you sleep less. They can, and then you look at precursors to a lot of prescription drugs that are coming in from, through Mexican drug cartels, through China. And this isn't me being conspiratorial. This is has been identified that happening. You see a strategy that's like, we're going to destroy people's attention spans. We're going to make them more anxious. We're going to sow kind of anger and social distrust. And then we're going to offer kind of cheap solutions through, street drugs that are potentially lethal. You can see this strategy evolving where it's the smoke-filled room, where we don't actually need to control the information anymore. We just need to take the means of the context because people will behave irrationally if that's all they see. So that's a long answer to your question with the crazy stuff. But when it comes to levels of sophistication in this long game of rewiring people's brains, it's happening on levels that I don't think the average person realizes because it is often so complex,
Yeah. Feels like poker players are going to inherit the world.
Yeah.
Because the way that they play the game has nothing to do with the cards.
Yeah.
And I think human beings are so obsessed with the mathematics of the cards, of what's happening, the data, that they're not looking at, well, the way that the guy just blinked gives you the tell that whatever he's saying isn't true. And those guys are like hyper focused on just the room, what's happening, the way the guy moved, the way he's thinking. Behind the cards. Like there's always a tell in terms of like whatever information is coming down the pipe, but you have to be have to have sort of this like hyper-tuned awareness to it.
Yeah.
That we don't. And so we're always kind of in the middle between all these topics.
Yeah.
Like what's actually happening? Like, for instance, let's take like the moon landing, for example, just to give you an example of how to think about things. Half of our listeners think it's crazy that people don't think we went. The other half think it's crazy that people think we went. And maybe there's an answer that's more complicated in the middle. Maybe we did see a PSYOP version, but then maybe we also went. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's like there's just more complicated nuances to, well, they had to kind of show a certain version of that, given the technology and the time. But maybe they had an ulterior motive of why they wanted to go that the rest of us aren't going to understand, and they're not going to tell us those things. And so I think that's just like that seems to be more of the answer to a lot of these rabbit holes, is like there's something that we don't know about the data we have, right?
Oh, no question.
Okay.
And I think that's what makes it challenging, right?
Yeah.
Right. Because people used to operate on sort of like with the idea of Occam's razor of like the most likely situations or is the most probable solution.
The simplest answer is the most probable,
Where it's sort of like we live in the age of the reverse Occam's razor, where a lot of times it's like, well, maybe it's something else. But a lot of times the thing is it's right. Like there is something else. But, the crazy thing too, and just to kind of circle back to your question about what's some of the craziest is like, because I often think about it through the context of faith, right? And as I know you guys do. And one of the things that people's kind of belief systems are easily manipulated as well. And like there's a story from like that we cover in the series, and it's it happened in the Philippines, and there was a rebel group called the Huck, and the CIA had been brought in to try to prevent this militia from kind of taking over these villages. And they brought in an army official who was actually a former ad agency guy. He worked for like Levi's and stuff like that. Yeah. And he was like, look, if this militia comes down from this mountain and takes over this village, a lot of people are going to get killed. And so he devised this campaign. While he was traveling at the time, he heard about a local belief in a cryptid called the Aswange, which was sort of like this vampire, like winged creature that was, local belief there wasn't questioned about it. They believed, and who knows? Look, I mean, you guys been in the cryptid space, like who knows what's out there, right? But it was just an accepted belief. And so what he did is he went to the village that they were trying to prevent this invasion from, and he told a couple people in the village to go and spread rumors around that the Aswange has been seen and that it is making the rounds, right? So they do it.
Yeah.
So then he has a couple guys in his unit, this army unit, and there's a Huck patrol going, and they basically pick off the last guy in the patrol without detection. So they kidnap one of these militants.
It's like Predator.
Yeah. So they bring him, they kill him, they put 2 holes in his neck.
Oh, jeez.
They hang him upside down and drain all the blood from his body, right? They then go lay this guy's corpse in the route that they know the militia is going to do a patrol at so that they find it. There's already been rumors that this Aswange is attacking people. They wake up one day and they see one of their own guys killed with the blood drained from his body with 2 holes in his neck. The militia retreated and never attacked the village. Huh. And that's a micro-psychological operation,
Yeah.
But it really shows when it comes to motivating people's actions, using supernatural beliefs or their kind of faith structure.
Yeah.
That's easily manipulated. There's one other case with that is in Vietnam. The United States they created, you can actually listen to them. They're called the ghost tapes. And they use sound engineering techniques to create these really ghost-like voices. So at the time in Vietnam, there was a belief system that if someone didn't get a proper burial, that their soul would sort of be in this
limbo.
Yeah. And it was this agony, and they would sort of just wander. And so they called it Operation Wandering Soul. They created these sounds, and you can listen to them. We play a clip in the series, but like it's a father saying, I want my family. I'm stuck. I need to see my dog. I mean, it's heartbreaking. Yeah. And it sounds distorted and creepy like a ghost. They would project these sounds into the jungle in an effort to like force defections and force retreats. It was so effective that some of our Vietnamese partners would not be present when it was being played because it's that disturbing to them. And I only bring up those two examples because I think for Christians particularly, I think there needs to be an awareness of our faith is obviously the source of our strength. But to your point earlier about, plants or whatever, it can also be manipulated if we don't have that discernment. And there has sort of, like those cases are real and they worked,
Yeah. So originally like World War II, they had those blow up tanks.
Yeah.
And they were just like lines of blow up military equipment. It wasn't real.
Yeah.
It was like a bounce house out there in the middle of nowhere. And yeah, I mean, back in the day, you could actually you couldn't tell the difference.
Yeah.
Kind of reminds me of The Office when Michael Scott has to tell 7 lies to cover up outing Oscar, remember?
Yeah.
And everyone's like, have you heard a crazy rumor today?
Yeah.
But these things happen.
Yeah.
And I think you're describing actual psyops have been, the data of this is actually something that they did. But I think that the problem is that, we sort of think everything's a psyop.
Yeah.
And then we go, like Luke said, we go into the next level. So coming back into reality, what's the motive?
Yeah.
Why do they do it?
Yeah.
And who's doing it, you think?
Yeah. So I think the one motive, like you mentioned earlier, is commercial, right? There's a financial incentive to have people addicted to devices or to medication or to whatever it is that they want to induce anxiety and screen addiction and all that. But I think when you look at internal psyops, right? So ones that are maybe our own intelligence agencies, I do think I've had the privilege of working with a lot of people who have worked. I mean, Sean was a former CIA contractor. Yeah. And I think a lot of their look, you can go through the history of the CIA and look at questionable tactics and things like that. But I think a lot of people who are in high-level military institutions and in intelligence agencies in the U.S. are patriots, and they're interested in the preservation of national security. I think a lot of them, right? Mm-hmm. But I think when you look at external factors or obviously adversarial nations, their motives are clear, which is there's a clear defense incentive to cause mass distrust in like I said, in institutions and to cause social unrest, to the normalization of political violence, things like that. But when it comes to internal psyops, I do think there are, technologies and national security secrets that great lengths will be gone to protect and to your point, to discredit people who may have information that could jeopardize those secrets.
And there's psyops against the whistleblowers.
Oh, for sure.
Like what they did to Bob Lazar sounded like a psyop.
Yeah. Well, like I said, there's a history of that. There's a history of, discrediting people.
Can you talk about organizationally? Because we talked pretty well about black, white, gray, and how our government actually talk about what the military is pragmatically doing and organized, because this is an organized operation for national security. Yeah. Right. But I tend to think of that in the same way, just like the Homeland NSA project, where they were just gonna spy on Americans to prevent terrorism, but then they never turn it off until Snowden blows the whistle, and then they try to kill him. Yeah, there's a real divisions within our military. Can you talk about how that works? So people understand there are people that this is their job, is to create psychological operations within the military.
For sure. And so this kind of evolved in the Reagan era, right? Where they were looking at how to counter Soviet psychological operations, because they were pretty straightforward. That was just you've seen the Obey giant posters. It was just straight up Soviet era propaganda. And the U.S. realized they needed to get more organized, What
was the KGB doing? So what was Russia doing?
Russia, their methods for a long time was mass indoctrination basically through an iron fist. Now, they have evolved. There was a guy named Yuri Bezmenov who defected in the 1980s. And you can still watch some interviews with him. And he talks about their evolution from sort of old school, kind of Stalinistic, just mass indoctrination programs to basically a lot of what we're seeing now, which is to cause people not to know truth from fiction. And what that does is it just is a slow deterioration. He has this crazy quote that like, you don't realize what's true until it's and not true until you have the boot on your neck and you're in the gulag already. Like you will basically march there if you can be deceived to that extent. And so those were sort of evolved. You know, there was a guy named Surkov who was a propagandist for the Kremlin who became obsessed. He was also like a theater guy. Really, and he's still around.
So theater nerds are bringing everybody down.
You got to watch out for him, I think. But he had seen this science fiction movie called Stalker. And in the movie, there's kind of implied there's like a UFO crash that creates this zone. And at the center of the zone, if you can make it there, you get your wish granted. Again, it's plot of the movie or whatever. And so you can hire these guys, stalkers, who will take you through the zone to try to get there. But when you're in there, reality breaks down and gravity doesn't exist. You can't tell, there's a scene where a pencil is rolling away. And he had the idea of like, well, what if we take this idea of the zone and we apply it to propaganda efforts? And instead of trying to indoctrinate people, we just deceive them to the point where in a vacuum of trust, we can get them to believe whatever. And so at one point he was like funding different groups that were ideologically opposed to the Kremlin, but also ideologically opposed to each other. And he planted information that's like, hey, these guys are accepting Kremlin money. These guys are accepting Kremlin money. Then he went out and said, hey, you're all right. And all of a sudden, everything they were accusing each other was true, but none of them they all refused to believe it. And so you had this complete evaporation of all their power because no one trusted anyone anymore.
It's literally us government shutdown in the U.S. here funding the Taliban.
Yeah,
funding Al Qaeda. Like we are funding our terrorist enemies. We fund Iran.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is like sometimes when reality becomes more absurd than what you think is possible, then you no longer be able to trust reality.
Yeah.
And that's so when you talk about the white, gray, and black, like, where it got complicated is like there is like an official Army PSYOP unit. Like the logo on the boxes, they call themselves the Ghost in the Machine. And they have some really cool recruitment videos that are also terrifying if you want to watch them on YouTube.
Ghost in the Machine.
Interesting. But, they operate officially, they operate under they can only execute white and gray propaganda campaigns. And how those distinctions are, white propaganda campaigns are like a traditional leaflet thing. Like, hey, we're going to bomb this area, you better get out of here. This is the U.S. military talking to you, or trying to force defections. Gray is unattributed. So they could plant, newspaper stories or something like that, right, and not give official attribution. But they are prohibited from lying. The Army is. But there was a realization in the 80s when they first kind of established this, that we probably need black propaganda too. And we don't want our service members to conduct that. That is going to be the realm of our intelligence agencies. And black propaganda campaigns are deception. And that is, we can lie, we can make people think this is coming from somewhere else. And so when you look at what the Army is doing, like I said, it's regulated to white and gray, but these black ones, it's legally permissible. It's part of psychological operations, doctrine, that the distinction will lie within intelligence agencies. And you see that around the world. But the other thing too is like with the advent of like deepfake technology and AI, that's when it's going to get scary.
Well, it's already here.
Yeah.
I think we're all kind of like sharing it. I remember somebody made a great post a couple of years ago, I think it was like a year ago, at a funeral with all the politicians smiling and hanging out with each other and kind of joking and laughing and being like, they all know that whatever the message is that they're pushing are psyops to get you divided, to control you. And then when there's a funeral and they're all hanging out and just like old pals in a room together, I think that's the sad part about us all, is that we are all at some level manipulated emotionally. Like we all believe a psyop right now, and we don't know we believe one. And so how do we go about living our lives now in this modern world where they don't have to drop bombs, and like you said, they just have to invent apps like TikTok, and the next thing you know, we're all psyop to death.
Well, I was going to actually ask you what your thoughts are on that, because traditionally, right, like our grandparents, there was like 5 channels.
Yeah.
And they watched one news channel, and that one news channel told them the news. And so reverse engineering that would be that like any message that the government or the powers behind the government wanted to get out just had to be on the news channel, and everyone watched Tom Brokaw and they all believed it.
Or send an agent into the news agency.
Yeah.
And he's passing Polaroids around to all the other newscasters.
Well, yeah, because that would happen too. Like, I mean, there are, if you look at, Operation Mockingbird, that's what they uncovered is the CIA was, and we actually did an episode in the series about these offices of, they're basically like, if you want to use like a battleship or cool military stuff in a movie, military officials get script supervision. I mean, even movies like Avatar, where, it's like, that's not even, like a military movie. Because Marines are in the movie, they could rewrite the script so that the battle happening on Earth didn't involve, military personnel, but was some sort of like, private contract or whatever. But
it's evolved, though. That's my point, is that like our grandparents were like, oh, this is the news, so it's true.
Yeah.
But there was just a couple channels. It was like ABC, NBC, CBS, and that's all you had.
Yeah.
Now we are in the social media age where, and the alternative media now is the thing, right? More people are getting their information from Twitter or X, Facebook, TikTok, media outlets that are independent, like Joe Rogan, et cetera, are the sources of information. I mean, it seems pretty obvious, and I think this question answered itself, but is social media the primary weapon, like dissemination weapon, that's being used against us now? Because we saw, it's very interesting. There was a study, I want to bring this up, in 2019 where the NYU and Stanford paid almost 3,000 people to quit Facebook for 1 month. They paid them to do it. And the results were that they spent more time with their friends and family and watching TV. They were happier by a significant quotient. They knew less about politics and were less outraged because of that. Yeah. And they use social media less in the future because they got off of it. But as we talked about previously, the algorithms are addictive. They are designed to be addictive for commercial purposes. But we know that's been hijacked for dissemination of information. We all saw this in 2020.
Yeah.
Like your whole the whole fate thing is literally 2020. Fear, attention, tribalism. If you don't do X, then you are bad. You can't participate in society. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. It's like a test.
But this is this the way that is this the way this is going?
Well, I think for the immediate, I mean, we had on this woman, Frances Haugen, and she was a former executive at it was Facebook at the time. And this was 2019, 2020, and she's now persona non grata. She was a whistleblower. She worked at the counter espionage unit, and she noticed that prior to that, when news feeds went from basically like a linear chronological display of like posts by your friends, to an algorithm that feeds you what you want, or there are levers that can be pulled to steer what you're seeing. That's when a tide started to turn, and she noticed there was a murder of a college professor in Ethiopia in the Tigray region, and at the time there was all this social unrest. Which, by the way, the Tigray region and the Ark of the Covenant and that whole rabbit hole is super fat. I'm sure you guys have done that.
So Ethiopia?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so, but around that time, and there's even kind of conspiracies involving the Ark of the Covenant there, but there's all this social unrest, including the area at that church where they
purportedly have talked to Bob Cornuke about that on the show. Yeah.
And so, but there's all this social unrest. And she ran the counter espionage unit at Facebook at the time, and she was trying to determine what has caused this. And there was a college professor who'd been murdered in his driveway, and he had been falsely accused of supporting a rebel group that was, kind of responsible for a lot of this violence. And she found that, all the posts accusing this guy were coming from outside of the country, and they were paid operatives that were planting that misinformation about someone to spark violence and fuel these social conflicts. And at one time she had found that I think it was in like Bangladesh, they were hiring like 11-year-old kids to set up fake American profiles with stolen pictures that could be used in some to make these, give validity to some of this stuff. So I do think in the interim, social media is what we need to be concerned about and having a degree of discernment. But where I think it gets kind of blurry too is the future evolution with the cognitive warfare stuff just beyond devious app design, but some of what is being developed that could potentially change people neurologically.
Let's get into that. Because we talked pre-roll. There's this show that I watched that made me think of this. It was called 0 Day. It's with Robert De Niro, who I don't particularly enjoy or like. But the show is interesting because he's a former president who's brought in for a 0 day thing, which is when all of the comms go down, everything goes down. It's this hack, right? But purportedly, he believes that they're using a weapon called Proteus on him, which is supposed to inflict traumatic brain injuries, manipulate brain function from a distance. It's a targeted weapon.
Yeah.
And when we were talking pre-roll, you were saying they're building these things and they're using them.
Yeah, I mean, so you guys may remember Havana Syndrome. A few years ago, there's a collection of diplomats that were at the time staying in a hotel in Havana, Cuba, and all of them reportedly had this weird. They all heard the sound at different points, and then they later started reporting. Some of them still have lasting neurological effects, traumatic brain injuries, dizziness, some temporary blindness, like serious stuff. And officially, there's been no determination of who's responsible. But a couple years ago, there was a car chase in the Florida Keys, of all places. And the police pull over this guy, and they find a burn bowl, so a bowl full of burned documents. They find a device that can erase the GPS information on the car, and a lot of suspicious stuff. Turned out the guy was a celebrity chef from Russia. He ends up getting interrogated, and during the course of the interrogation, they also find out that he's a Russian spy. Yeah. And during the time he was being interrogated, one of the women with the FBI went home that night, and she hears a ring in her ear to the point where it's so painful she collapses. And this is at the time that she's interrogating a potential Russian spy. Wow. What is capable with some of these cognitive warfare weapons? You mentioned, Project Bluebeam, the Havana Syndrome stuff, where it's just sending a direct, frequency that is.
It's like infrasound.
Yeah. And I mean, but the level that they can do it, I mean, they even have like crowd dispersion devices, like called an LRAD, long range acoustic device, that can mess with your organs. I mean,
so there's like PSYOPs that are like actual lasers. You could shoot a laser.
And then there's sharks with freaking laser beams.
Well,
and then there's PSYOPs like Jordan Rubin came on and said, cereal was a PSYOP. Cereal was to feminize men, right? And like it's that complex where we're developing a product, we're going to market it and push it out to the world, but it's the same thing. We just want to control. We want to dumb down people.
But they're building weapons to do that.
But you can do a laser, and now it's sort of getting so, I guess, precise that they can shoot a beam through a window and mess with you.
So there's another project I was telling you guys I'm involved in with that Tim and LA were on episodes, and we wanted to test the feasibility of Project Bluebeam. Could you implant a voice into someone's head and make them think they are hearing a voice? And we were just using consumer level technology that if you like, we could all pull a few $100 and buy enough devices and spend a couple days with it and get it working right. And this is what we did for this TV show. And with that level of technology, we were able to deceive someone to the point where they believed they were hearing a voice in their head.
Wow.
And it uses, it's almost like when divers dive, they don't have stuff in their ear. They have something on the back of the ear. It's like voice to bone, where it will vibrate. You can do that with a direct beam of sound. I had them test it on me because I was just kind of curious of what it sounded like. Yeah. And it sounds like someone's in your head. And that's consumer level technology at this stage. This guy I talked to, his name's Commander Jake Beber in the series. He kind of alluded to devices that could create a confusion field. So if there's an enemy invading, like let's say a beach or something, you could use a cognitive warfare direct energy device that would cause them to get completely disoriented. He also mentioned one that, and he didn't get into too many details about it, but a time manipulation device that people's perception of time changes dramatically, where they start moving much slower. And so if you look at the battlefield implications of something like that, and this
it's like that dream we all have. I used to have a recurring dream of playing basketball in high school. Yeah. And everybody else moves at full speed, and I was like slow. I just couldn't move, I just couldn't get my feet to go fast. Yeah, that's gonna be real.
Yeah, I mean, well,
it's a nightmare, bro.
I mean, look, this is stuff that's happening now. So Rice University is working with DARPA, and they have a helmet, and it uses magnetic acoustic resonance. It uses magnets, and there's no display. So you put the helmet on, right, and it projects the image of whatever drone they're controlling to their head. There's no wire.
That's crazy.
And this is real. Like, it sounds like science fiction.
Yeah.
And so, you guys have mentioned like Project Bluebeam and the sort of mechanics of that seem somewhat implausible. But when you look at some of this stuff, it's also like,
people have experienced that with cryptid encounters or UFO encounters. Around a UFO, the technology, the gravity, anti-gravity tech creates time distortions. They're around a cryptid creature. They're having visual and audio experiences. Like, it's these beings do this already.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of hacking that technology through wires and batteries.
Yeah, but I think the other thing that's interesting when you say that out loud, though, Nate, is like, the ultimate pragmatic that we talked to, Tim Alberino, would just say that, like, a lot of this is technology. Like, a lot of, maybe it's just technology. Yeah. Maybe
Bigfoot just has some tech.
Well, advanced aerospace technology is just, the angels are farther, as he was called, the other races farther ahead of us.
Yeah.
And they've got more tech, right? It's interesting to spin it that way, because
but that tech doesn't look like our understanding of technology.
No, but it's also like, we've so disenchanted our worldview that, like, or we try to enchant it with it just as sort of like this magic thing, and perhaps there's more of a pragmatic aspect to it.
Yeah, I think there's sometimes, and I grew up probably relatively similar circles, like kind of evangelical circles, where there's this almost false dichotomy between the natural and the supernatural.
Yeah.
It seemed like this fine line between, but that differentiating line was basically how explainable something is with observable, or like traditional sort of scientific method. And listening to your guys' shows actually kind of opened me up to this a lot too, is the idea is that maybe that distinction is just a matter of understanding and perception, that between whether what we would call technology, like when I was talking to that guy, that commander, he was like, your brain is electrical signals. Like, that's why Neuralink works, because you can just manipulate the signals in your brain. And it's like, if you look at like a old school radio receiver, if you put an antenna up, there are frequencies that are going into the air.
Yes.
That if you have the right device to channel it into a transmitter,
just tune to the right frequency.
And it's like, well, our brains are electrical, and like when you look at sort of how people describe different supernatural encounters, I'm just saying, like, maybe there is some sort of functionality to it that is just outside of our current understanding. That doesn't make it less real,
Right. But maybe there's more of a pragmatic, answer, right?
Yeah.
It's really,
and we kind of stumble upon it. I mean, I think we, over time we're just so limited, but it kind of reminds me of, like, the DeLorean in 1985 versus him trying to get it to work, back in back in the Western cowboy days. He had to do all this extra stuff to get the technology that's been, you look at some of the rockets now that Elon Musk, and just like the original prototype to what it is now, it seems like it all condenses. And now we have these microscopic microchips that used to take up rooms and buildings, and it just gets more shrunk down to the point where you don't need any wires anymore. So now we have this wireless technology, and I think what we describe on our show is these beings and entities have this wireless technology, and we call it dimensional, or we use our words that because we don't understand. There's no wires and batteries, so how does that work for us as 80s kids? But it's here, and so now they can press a button and get a whole crowd of people to feel whatever they want, to move how they want, and to freak out. So they can project an infrasound to freak out a crowd. This is kind of where we're at. Right?
That it is, and like I said, I know it sounds crazy, but the people who I was fortunate enough to
hear it. It sounds crazy.
Yeah,
there you go.
But I do think I don't want to be too pessimistic either, because
exactly.
Because I'm like you guys, I'm a believer too, and
this is where I want to go.
Yeah,
Jesse, is it like? It's funny enough, like your past, you worked for Relevant Magazine. Yep. I used to get the actual copy back in the day.
Cool,
so we
man.
did have previous upbringings. That whole idea was to talk about the intersection of Christianity and culture.
Yeah.
And so that context, I think this is going to be a very depressing conversation. Like, because then what do you make of all this? All the waters are muddied, right? Like, so as believers, in your opinion, you just did this 8-part series with Sean Ryan on PSYOPs, like, completing this project, what is your take as a believer on
Yeah, you're like Will Smith at the end of Enemy of the State. And you're like, what do I do now?
Or you're Neo, and you're like, I'm going to step out of the Matrix.
I would say, because this is scary, right? Yeah. But I think that's kind of the fun of exploring it too. Is that you get to kind of understand what capacities are out there. But I'm also an optimist, right? And my faith is central to my worldview and how I see things. And so, one, I believe first off the Bible, and know how it sounds cliche, but sort of the book ends. I do also think like it's made me rethink about the idea of discernment, because I think sometimes we have a somewhat limited understanding of that based on like, oh, well, I got a bad vibe about this person or that person. But when you start not to be able to realize what is real and what's not real, whether it's a deep fake video or some, thought that's being planted in your head or misinformation, I do think as Christians, we have some obligation to rely on the role of the Holy Spirit, right?
Sure.
Number one, to kind of have that context. But also, like, throughout the series, we looked at, like, the smoke-filled room. We looked at this thing called the Milgram experiment. All these mid-century was, like, a wild time for psychological experiments. But we also looked at the work of Robert Maslow, who's famously like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And essentially like whatever, if your baseline needs are met. So if you're like warm, you're well fed, you feel loved, you feel this, you can get to a point of like what he called self-actualization. But if any of those baselines are threatened, right? So if you're super cold, if you're in pain, if you're hungry, all you're going to think about that is that. And so a lot of these efforts are to threaten that, right? Is to cloud your ability to think about anything other than something that's going to be a threat to you or your family or whatever it is. But Robert Maslow, he had this theory that societies worked on this idea of domination, that people who had more power would ultimately dominate people with less power to preserve it. And he ended up going to this tribe that's somewhat isolated in Canada called the Blackfoot tribe. And he wanted to live there for a while because they had a social structure that sort of wasn't influenced by outside things. And what he observed there is the most powerful people in that tribe were the people who had given everything away. And that wealth was determined by who had given the most, not who had received the most. And it really altered what he came to believe is the ultimate sort of motivating factor for people. And it was a life-changing experience because he believed that the psychology of manipulation isn't about the preservation of power through dominance. It's can we get to a place where social hierarchy is structured in a way that it's basically like the Beatitudes, like the least of these. And he believed that what he had witnessed reframed what he believed the ultimate human motivation was. And so all this stuff is scary, but I do think that is the core message of the gospel too, where if you can get people to, a place where one, they believe in the message of the gospel in Christ, but two, live Christ-like. It is the antidote to all of this. And it's the antidote because if you believe in the message of the gospel, you're no longer like the fear, the grabbing of attention, the tribalism, this addiction through engagement.
Right.
That breaks it because that is the baseline for the tool. And so I'm very optimistic, but my optimism is aligned not just with sort of the pragmatic stuff in the series, but with my faith.
It's like Jesus was breaking Psyops from the beginning.
Yeah.
And I think that, we all grew up with the verse or the description of, I am the way, the life, and the truth. And I think I've always thought the truth is just an easier way to, but really, I mean, he describes himself as the truth, maybe because there are so many psyops going on since the dawn of time. Jesus is the truth.
Yeah.
Because you're like, is he good? Is he bad? Is he this? Is he that? Is that? And then you have all these religions, and then Jesus is showing up in dreams to people in the modern era who've been so psyoped they can't even see. And then in the dream state, he's like, I'm here. And they instantly know what the truth is. How do they know that Jesus is the truth instantly? It transcends all the lies that they've ever been told, and they know it. And I think we all kind of need that sort of shock and wake up in this modern world. And I think churches are, being flooded. People are kind of picking up Bibles. Bibles are selling again. They know that all these messages coming at them is inundating them, and they can't figure out what the truth is. And so it's interesting. I think doing this show, it's almost made me understand Jesus in a way that I could never really hear as a kid growing up in church and Christian school.
Yeah.
I didn't really understand it. I knew there was something bigger there. I knew Jesus was the way, but I didn't really understand just sort of how much of a doorway he is into this other way of thinking and experiencing everything. It's kind of a rant there. But.
No, but I like something you said earlier too. Is like, yeah, when you think about it, even in the context of how we're understanding it, like the Bible is full of psyops, like the Garden of Eden, like the adversary of Christ is the great deceiver, right? Like and perfect love casts out fear.
Well, all the gods were psyops, right?
Yeah,
all the gods were it was a mini heaven. A mini version of heaven. You built your temple, you built your little, utopia here on earth, and we've uncovered some of those megalithic dynasties. But I think that was always a psyop. There's many gods. They were real. People worship,
but they claim to be the true and on the throne, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's Deuteronomy 32.
Yeah.
It's the dividing of the nations, and they all said, "Well, worship me." These angels took worship, and they became I'm the God, right?
Yeah.
And so these were all deceptions.
All the heavenly deceptions, all the entities in those realms, humans are doing the same thing. I think we're like a human agency of trying to establish a one world system where we're at the top of it all. But then you have fourth, fifth, sixth dimension, whatever entities doing the same thing, but they're just smarter. And they know how to deceive us even more so.
Well, but like I said, the idea of the truth is ultimately
the King of Kings.
Yeah, exactly. And
right.
And what we mentioned too, like truth is power.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Whoever holds that truth ultimately has the power because it is the antidote to deception. And whether that's on a psyop level where they're trying to trick you about a world conflict, or whether it's on a spiritual level, I do think that's why understand like. The scary stuff about doing the series just between us was like, like the sophistication and how susceptible we are. But the comforting thing was more of the psychology, right? Like it only works because something like the fate model works.
Right.
Like if that didn't work, none of the technology or none of the methods, it would all fall apart. But it's manipulating our emotion and sort of our weaknesses. Because if you can protect that, it doesn't really matter the methodology anymore.
Let's talk about that, because I think that's what is impressed upon me, is that it begins with fear, right? And I think the Bible says 145 times, some version of "don't be afraid." There's a myth that says 365. It's a psyop. It doesn't actually say that many times. It's 100 and one for every day, right?
Yeah.
That's convenient, but it's not true. It's about 145 times we're told not to be afraid. And then also we're told that in Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all things. Right. And it's not lost on me that like the beginning of a psyop is fear, which is an emotion. And we're told that our heart is deceitful and to not be afraid. And I think wrapping that also in discernment, we've talked about, I think in our space too, and I think that we've talked to a couple of theologians, Dr. Joel Mutamale, for example, about the idea of discernment. And I think a lot of people will convolute their emotions with discernment. Like this makes me feel a certain way, so this is my discernment.
Like hyper discernment.
Yeah.
That's what Dr. Judd likes to say.
Yeah.
But I think these are all, I think what's important is listening to you talk about this from like a biblical worldview is that the beginning of a psyop is to make you afraid, and we're told to not be afraid. Now, we're going to be afraid. That's part of being human, but as long as we don't play into our fear, we can resist the psyop.
Exactly, because that is in any of these, like I said, we studied all these psychological experiments, and if you create conditions of fear, you at that point
you control the masses.
Yeah, and
this is
confusion.
2020.
Yes. Fear and confusion is, and this is even for like hypnotism, like I was saying earlier, that is the point of suggestibility. But if you refuse to be afraid, and you seek discernment to overcome confusion, or you just don't play into, because a lot of it is just like recognizing someone's trying to rage bait you, but recognizing also that the end game of that is radicalization and potentially to make you, not just someone freak out and throw a coffee at a barista or something, but like, I'm going to take up arms against this or that. And like, it is a path that people are being led down, whether they recognize it or not, but the anecdote remains the same because we're all susceptible to receiving this information, but our posture coming into it, whether it's fear or just the acknowledgement that we're being manipulated.
But it's all antithetical to the Bible, right?
Exactly.
Because we are afraid, we give that fear attention, and then we pick a side. So we don't love our neighbors or love others. We pick a side, and then we look for people picking the same side, and we farm that engagement, that feedback, right? Which it's literally social media.
And then they're all hanging out at the funeral, laughing at each other.
Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
Is that the reason the Holy Spirit exists? Because there are psyops.
I think that's making it very binary.
No, well, I think
think about it. Like,
but I think like conceptually, right? Like
why do we need a spirit? Why do we need the Holy Spirit? If Jesus is the door to God,
because he left us with the Holy Spirit.
But what does the Holy Spirit do? Like, that means that we have spiritual attack.
Yeah.
We have other spirits coming at us all the time.
Yeah.
We need some help.
He's the helper.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, but
against what?
Yeah, I love that. I love that idea about the Holy Spirit because the Holy Spirit. I mean, we can get in theological territory here. If
we are here,
too, bro.
It is sort of a mystery, right? Like in terms of even just. I don't know all the nuance. I've listened to you guys enough to kind of recognize the similarities of probably our theological backgrounds or upbringings, right? But but even the idea of the Trinity was reduced to something very understandable. Where I think about like the book of Job a lot, but the end of the book where he comes to God and he wants answers. And the first thing God says to Job is, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" Yeah. Like it goes back to the ancient stuff, but then. He says, Job, there are some truths that are too wonderful for you to know. And some of it, I think it's just outside of our understanding, but that's why faith is a requirement. And when you look at something like the mystery of the Holy Spirit, of like kind of what's the point of this, of this sort of like third thing in the Trinity, like we understand like God is on a throne. Jesus walked among men. But the Holy Spirit, I mean, the Holy Ghost when I was growing, you know what I mean? Like that was
in the Old Testament, the Spirit goes before the Israelites. So you have the Holy Spirit's there as well. It's not something that's birthed out of Jesus leaving. The Holy Spirit's always been there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but if you understand the framework of principalities, powers, thrones, dominions, Jesus is the king of other kings. What are those kings? All these others, spiritual hierarchy. You're going to need some kind of map and torch to get through it all.
Yeah, we're also not going to know it all. But we're not. Point, Jesse. Yeah.
But I mean, I would say the resurrection of, like, crucifixion of Jesus starts with the psyop.
Of course it does.
Like right away. Oh, someone stole the body. Yeah. You know what I mean? It starts with the psyop. And so, but that's when the Holy Spirit shows up. So you have this like psyop thing where Jesus didn't actually raise from the dead. And then we get the Holy Spirit as humanity gets the Holy Spirit like soon after.
Jesus shows up, walks through walls, touch my hands.
Yeah, but it's like,
Road to Emmaus.
But the government narrative, the religious was the government, kind of the day, but they are saying, whatever. I don't know. I just think that's interesting that you had a choice at the beginning to believe it. Wait, did this just happen or not? Wait, did they steal the body in the middle of the night? You know, like it's been going on since the beginning.
Well, and I think the other thing too is just like when it comes to our approach and especially people's faith, and you guys help me out if I'm butchering the verse, but being gentle as doves and sort of wise as serpents, you know.
Yeah.
I think there is we are conditioned in this sort of angry cultural moment we're in is to forget the gentle as doves part. And I think that's part of why PSYOPs work is like everyone wants to be as wise as a serpent, but gentleness is hard, especially when it's at the face of aggression or hostile, no one likes being abused online or having their values or ideologies sort of attacked. Yeah. But I think approaching it with gentleness first, because I think when you don't, it clouds our ability to be wise. When you're just talking about the character of God.
Well, it requires some humility, and wisdom without humility is haughtiness. It's not wisdom.
Yeah, I think Roosevelt said, "Speak softly, but carry a big stick."
Yeah,
right?
Said that? Was it Nacho Libre?
I think that was Roosevelt.
I think Teddy.
President.
Yeah, I think it was Teddy. Yeah,
I learned something in school, but yeah, I mean, it's true. It's like there's this like, and we see that as God, you know, the lamb and the warrior, right? Like how Jesus is described, and
we know there's a great psyop coming. I mean, to kind of like cap this, right?
I mean, and that was so interesting to me is like, there's some speculation when it comes to like my interpretation of this through like sort of like a biblical worldview. And most of the series is everything in there's, we try to be verifiable as possible without speculation. But if I'm knowing what I know now, especially after spending all this time in this world, it does change how I read like the end times narrative and the mechanisms of deception.
But it won't be, I think what we've learned is it will be a promise of utopia.
Yeah.
It won't be like you knowingly are walking through, you know, the volcano into hell.
Yeah.
Like it's a utopian promise.
Yeah, but I think this will be wrapped in fear because it's going to be a psyop. So it'll be like the fear is...
Initially, it won't be, I don't think.
But I think the fear is like, it's that if you don't take the mark, if you don't do X, Y, Z, you're going to left behind. If you don't put the chip in your brain, you can't compete because you don't have the internet inside your brain. You can't, you don't, you know, there's going to be these things that the fear is going to be some FOMO, and also attached
to tribalism
and financial things. Like you won't be able to compete. You don't have the machine.
But I think the way the Christians often present the end times is like this obvious choice of doom and gloom. But I think it's going to be very subtle. Of eternal life. You will have eternal life if you do this, and it'll be great.
Yeah,
it'll be awesome. I think that it's going to be so enticing. It's going to be like anything else. It's going to be really hard to say no to it because it's going to look like the real deal, and it won't be.
Well, and that's why I think, because I used to think of that in like supernatural terms, which I'm not discounting that, but I also know there are natural means of manipulating how people think and feel.
Which is crazy. Yeah. So they just can scramble your eggs a little bit, and So how much tinfoil do we need?
A lot. You know what's funny? Is I was just down a rabbit hole the other day about lead paint. They used to have lead paint on houses, right? Lead paint. You put lead on you, and you have the X-rays.
Oh, yeah.
And so the lead on the house kept you from all the rays,
the EMF, and all that.
It's like a Faraday cage.
So people are starting to paint their houses with lead again because they're so paranoid of all the waves, and maybe that's.
Yeah, who knows? And,
right?
And
is
like,
that interesting?
Yeah, and I don't know. Like, unfortunately, and that's like I would say that, you know, these military officials are like, no, this is scary stuff. There's not. I don't know if there is like an effective sort of like shield. You know, maybe. You know, but I don't know.
Well, they sell EMF caps now. You can buy the hats and you can buy the beanies.
We just gotta throw water on the aliens. We've seen the movie.
Well, and not to forgive me if I'm like plugging too much, but that other show I was telling you about that I worked on, that Tim and LA and some different people were on, we did an experiment.
Does it have a name yet?
It's called Shadow Figures.
Shadow Figures.
And it's not out yet, but I would encourage anyone who wants to learn more. There's a guy, Chad Robichaud, who is the host. If you follow him, he'll release kind of updates of when it's going out. But we did a test with some land navigation experts who had gone through like Ranger training school. And we wanted to find out if EMF exposure using like kind of Faraday blockers changed their ability to do a blind land navigation course. And again, I was very surprised at the results. It was pretty surprising, like how. And again, I don't have an explanation for it. It was sort of. But I will say this too: during the research for that show, and sorry for the rabbit trail, but I thought it was interesting. During the research for that show, the whole kind of construct is like what's real and what's kind of woo, right? And so, but this idea of a sixth sense that we don't understand, maybe it is sensitivity to like electromagnetic field energy or whatever. I found this guy, and he's at Caltech, and he has what they call the Mag Lab. And he's an interesting guy. His team was open to the idea of us working with him, but some logistics didn't work out. But anyway, he's a little bit of an outsider in the world of neurology, but he's always been fascinated by hybridatory animals, like animals that are capable of mass migration, seemingly using some sort of sensitivity to the Earth's poles, or why there's like a sea turtle returned to the beach it was born on after kind of being afloat. He thought maybe there's something there, and he has a lab that operates. It's basically you sit in a Faraday cage, and they spin magnets around you at different energy levels while he has like, if forgive me anyone listening there if I'm butchering into the nuances of this, but like EEG machines measuring brain wave activity And he can measurably demonstrate that some people have an unexplainable neurological sensitivity to EMF, which there's no neurological reason for that to happen. But it does give credence to this idea that some people would be more sensitive to whether it is sort of like having a sixth sense of direction or whatever it is. He's doing research that finds that there might be some credence to that. But all I have to say is like, who knows what we might find when it comes to...
Nate's got that. He can always find the burrito place. I don't know how he does it, dude.
Yeah.
Just, dude, North Star right to the...
Sensitive.
Right to the carne asada.
Well, here's a question for you.
Yeah.
So where do you feel like the line changes between like, say... I mean, obviously, most people are listeners, me and Luke, and I'm familiar with ideas in the Book of Enoch where technology was given to us. Yeah. When do we humans manipulate technology and we go too far? We dam up a river. We use the water... creates electricity.
Yep.
Is that a sin, right? Is that a sin against God's creation? Most people would argue, no, it's not a sin, right? Animal husbandry. We take care of animals. We have a farm and we eat them. Like, is that a sin? Is that but then there's like this technology we're manipulating things way beyond. Like, where's the line? How do we know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say it's interesting to say that because one of the things that has come up in this kind of Chinese military doctrine in recent years that the State Department defense officials are concerned about is the recurring idea of biological dominance. And this term is found throughout sort of any of their leaked military strategy, where one of the things we covered in the series was they were able to have like someone with their mind control a mouse in a maze. Right? This is through implantables, brain-to-brain interfaces. But there's also potentially, there are weapons that are being engineered right now that, like if there was an invasion of a certain country, that different sort of genetic makeups would not be susceptible to certain biological agents. But when you talk about this idea of where is the line, when you look at this idea of biological dominance, again, it goes back to that philosophical idea of dominance over sort of, this Christ-likeness. I think we're going to come up on that line really quick here, because I think the incentive to manipulate biology, human biology, for defense purposes.
Super soldiers.
Yeah. Or nano, there's a lot of concern about like nanotechnology that could manipulate people on sort of a biological level.
Injectables, yeah.
Yeah. I think, when you talk about the manipulation of nature or sort of, I do think there's some biblical precedent, I think we're called to be good stewards, but I also think the early promise that Satan said to Adam and Eve was, you will be like God. And I think biological manipulations that promise godlike abilities is probably a red flag. I'm not an ethicist, like a transhumanist ethicist, but I think
we've sort of blown that whistle softly on the show about the abduction phenomena. People are being abducted and biological experience are happening. Yeah. You think that's what's going on? Like, you think that's what part of it? Like, if you've looked into this?
Yeah, I think there's open experimentation going on, not necessarily
on craft.
Yeah.
Off world.
Yeah, potentially, because I think it's happening on world too.
Yes.
Well, yeah. I guess technically, where is that?
Yeah.
In the sky, is that on world?
Yeah.
No, I think that what Jesse's saying is I think it's happening within the parameters of government.
It's happening human on human.
Black projects. Yeah.
Like human trafficking, and then there's entities trafficking humans.
Yeah. Because we know biology is capable of manipulation, and not every institution operates under, some of them, someone I was talking to about a foreign adversary in some of these programs had basically said, like, there are no ethical considerations, only long-term dominant ones, the only thing we're considering is what is the long-term outcome, and ignoring sort of the, manipulating by, like, literally creating super soldiers. Like that is stuff that's being experimented with at least in ways that, the ways that we even know, like I said, the brain-to-brain interfaces, right? That sounds pretty weird, but that's an open academic study with an institution that's funded by the Chinese military. Imagine the stuff that's going on kind of behind the scenes.
That you don't hear about.
Yeah.
How do you reread like ancient stories in the Bible now? Was the Nephilim a dominance thing, biological dominance thing with the garden, the Tower of Babel? Are these all interpreted, these stories, differently in your mind now?
Certainly from when I was like younger, I think, but since like doing this series, I do, one thing I do think about is how, like, in sort of the Book of Enoch and the Nephilim scenario, like I do think of how it was like we were talking about earlier, how artificial the line sometimes is between natural and supernatural with that, like these like kind of beings or what you know, ultimately like the story of particularly the Old Testament is about man's relationship with non-human intelligence, right? And it's not how we think of it today, maybe, but like when you look at Mount Hermon or you look at kind of the Nephilim narrative, and there seems to be some sort of technological transfer. I often think about the Ark of the Covenant. I know you guys have covered it before, but like the Ark of the Covenant was, could be weaponized. You know,
it was. It was carried before the armies of Israel.
It brought down the thickest wall of the most powerful fortified city in the world. You know,
it parted water. I mean, it was the throne of Yahweh. It parted waters. It was a.
So you're saying it was weaponized, though?
Well, I think that's I think that's why it was so scary when Solomon's Temple was raided. And
then the Nazis found it and it melted people's faces.
Well, you look at the rod of Aaron, which was affixed to the side of it was the rod of Aaron that was used to part the Red Sea. Again, like I sometimes I wonder about. The word technology almost sounds irreverent. I don't mean it in an irreverential way. Like I think God is capable of whatever, but I sometimes. You can't help but wonder, why is there some implement, some tool that is being used in these kind of crazy parting of the sea or breaking down walls?
Oh, it's like it's like holding up the serpent on the stick, and everybody. It's
just the sort of the things we've heard a lot on our show just about copper in general over the years, just like what copper can do. They were mining it. They were trying to figure out it's conductive. It's what wires.
That's why you wear copper underwear.
That's why I wear copper underwear. You can line a building in it and no EMF gets in, just like lead. Copper is a safer one. It's water pipes. Nothing sticks to it. I mean, it's just the ancients knew these things.
Yeah.
And we're kind of discovering them slowly over the last 2,000 years. Like, oh, there's something more to this. People are sticking these rods in their garden and they're growing like 4 times as much. I saw a video the other day, a guy shooting he's a cloud buster is what he called it. And he had these copper pipes. I don't know if you saw this video, it's going around. And he points at a cloud and the cloud goes away because he's trying to build machines to directly counter chemtrails. And using these copper pipes. It's just bananas, but it's like PSYOP on PSYOP.
Yeah.
Now you've got like, they're spraying this stuff on us. Everyone says, oh, that's fake. It's contrails.
Yeah.
And now there's a new documentary coming out that says chemtrails are real.
Yeah.
I think is what it's called. It's called like Climate Trails. It's a new documentary. I saw the trailer. I thought, this is great. But it's been debated for the last 30 years that they're doing this. And now these people are like, screw that. We're going to build our own rockets to take these things down. But I don't know. I'm just trying to say is that like, this technology has always been with us. It's always existed. They seem to know. We're kind of slowly catching up to it. But the dominance problem is that if we all have access to this, there comes a point when it's out of the box. We can't control it. Human beings will be slaves to the technology that was supposed to free us.
Well, it's the analogy of, when... again, any Greek scholars will probably get mad at the butchering, but like
got some,
when Prometheus stole fire from the gods, in this metaphor, the revenge on humanity for this theft of heavenly technology was a box. And if that box were to be opened, who knows what would be inside? And of course, Pandora in the story opened it and it unleashed all means of despair on humanity. But it was the result of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. Obviously, I read that metaphorically, but I also think to the degree that you're talking about, there's some sort of truth to the idea behind it, even in like a biblical narrative. It's like when you seek sort of these godlike abilities, there are lines that could be crossed, and the result could be a box opened that what escapes is going to be pretty terrible, but that's an ancient myth. And I think I don't think us or even Christians are the first ones to sort of contend with this idea,
So do you think that sort of Satan is at the top of this pyramid of control and domination? Like that is the sort of the original sin, is to control, manipulate, and destroy. But the way he does it is sort of lures us in over time and have our governments partnered with some of these entities.
Listen, I think it's possible. I mean, I think if you look at the biblical narrative, I mean, again, like this is a little outside of my depth in terms of like theology, but to my understanding, there are like principalities in the Old Testament that seem to have like regional boundaries, like geographically, you know, and that would seem to insinuate some sort of, I don't know if it's like an alliance with the rulers of that geographical area, but there seems to be some sort of alignment with physical areas on earth and whatever these powerful entities are in the biblical narrative, where it seems like if that was what was happening in the past, it doesn't seem outside the realm of possibility that something like that would be happening today on a more institutionalized level, just because of the development of, you know, how governments have been, you know. I do think seems to be some sort of like biblical precedent for that.
I guess my last question is kind of always like out of the box of or just like trying to process all these things, you know, and obviously the whole catalog of blurry creatures is always sort of in my mind. It's like, what's the best state of a human being then? Like, without the technology, with the technology, like, where's the happy zone? Where do we? You know, we don't use anything after 1986. Like, come on, like let's.
You would love that.
Yeah.
What's our resting state? What were we designed to be? How do we resonate here down in this plane?
Well, man, that is a great question. And like, I often think about like how we're called to pursue the mind of Christ, right? And then you can look at, you know, these different chapters in the development of the early church and the embrace of sort of like mysticism early on. Like you look at like the Desert Fathers or these different sort of camps of believers that took the pursuit of the mind of Christ into, you know, pretty crazy directions when it comes to isolation and spiritual practices. Now, when it comes to like a state of technology, I think that's probably ever evolving. But there's so much. I would say this, like, I don't know if it's a matter of like how much we are utilizing technology. I think it's how much we are, one, seeking the like limits of that technology for the right reasons. I mean, you even there's so much mystery baked into, look at the Magi. You look at the figures who kind of show up, Melchizedek or whatever. Like there's a lot of strangeness and mystery and sort of mysticism built into the biblical narrative. Sure. And I think if we're talking about technologies that seem to blur the line between the physical, the natural, and the supernatural, is the end game for power and dominance and to get to the bottom of the mystery? And is it to get to solve sort of what these, you know, everyone was looking for? Or is it to seek the mind of Christ, which will get us closer to God and ultimately establish his kingdom, which is, like we talked about earlier, it's an inverted power structure where the least are first, and the most powerful are the ones who have relinquished their power. I think it's less about what those technologies are to a point about kind of biological, you know, transhumanism and ethics. There's certainly some lines that I think pretty clearly we shouldn't cross, but I don't know necessarily about the technology. I think it's about the desired outcome, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's the spirit. It's the spirit of why you're doing it.
Probably an unsatisfying answer, but I don't know if there is a hard line technologically, you know?
Well, there just seems to be like a lack of humility in all these projects and all this.
Yeah.
It's like a certain mindset of like, we could do what we want.
Yeah.
We could do what we want. Like, and we argue that all the way from why the pyramids were built. Was that a weather modification tool of the ancients? Like, we're gonna do it how we want to do it. We're gonna manipulate the weather. We're gonna manipulate genetics. We're gonna manipulate God's creation, plants, animals. We're gonna create chimeras. We're gonna just manipulate everything.
Yeah.
And sort of humans were built and designed in a state of almost like naivety. For a good reason, enough to have dominion here and name the animals, live life, have a garden, grow, and enjoy this, but not enough to start manipulating everything. Yeah. And then the entities come down and teach us how to do that, and then that goes all the way up to government psyops. If they're still doing it, they're still taking people on a nightly basis, and you know, guys like Alberino and all these ufologists are trying to blow the whistle on that. And then you have these other entities like you've uncovered covering that up. And saying it's not happening. It's not even real.
Or manufacturing experiences to discredit people. Yeah.
But since the dawn of time, sort of this manipulative behavior has been going on since the garden to this day. And ultimately, there's going to be a major end game manipulation, right? Yeah. We're moving towards that, where all humans can be controlled at one time. The whole world this technology will be able to ensnare all of us, right? Think that's tech that's coming?
I will say, again, I think there are scary technological possibilities that are coming. But I think even like if you look at the advent of like the atomic bomb or something, everyone had sort of the same scenario in their head. And there was a great fear that like we've created a kill switch and eventually it will be used. And maybe it will. But I think also even kind of outside sort of, I don't want to come across as overly like, I still believe in, and part of this is just having worked with a lot of people kind of in the, special operations community, in the military. We can point all day at like corruption and all this stuff happening in our government level, but I think there are a lot of good people still in positions of power that are deeply concerned about, and a lot of them have very, I think, pure selfless motives to protect the American people, but also the American idea, which allows us to have conversations like this, which allows us to question power. I don't think and again, maybe I'll take some criticism for this, but I don't think every institution is totally corrupt to the core. Right. I think the institutions are susceptible to corruption, but I think those institutions have eventually exposed themselves. And what we're trying to do, and I think what you guys are the heart of this too, is like, there's a difference between like exposure for the sake of like taking down an institution and exposing stuff for the means of keeping those institutions accountable so that they can remain doing the work that's in the best interest of the people they're supposed to serve. And so that gives me some hope that, there are also as many forces who want to use this to dominate people. There are other forces that are very concerned about that possibility and are doing quite a bit, including some people giving their lives to prevent it from happening.
Well, tell everybody about it's a new audio docu-series hosted by Sean Ryan called PSYOP.
Yep.
And where can they?
Yeah, you can get it at psyopshow.com. All 8 episodes now. So
this has been fun, man.
Yeah. Thank you guys for having me. This was a real thrill.
Hopefully it was like not too much of a rodeo for you.
No, I listen. I've been listening for a long. I hope I didn't ramble too much.
No.
No, this was great, man.
It's just hard to like know how to think about a lot of these things, and it seems in the last 5 years, like the beginning, doing this, there was a little bit more of like kind of knew, and now it just feels like it's harder and harder by the day to know what's going on.
Well, and that kind of leads me to think there's something is going on, because I think all that is intentional, and that's what I really learned kind of doing this is like, these things are sophisticated, like the levels that people with the incentive and the tools will go to deceive people, to hide truth that would jeopardize their power is very far,
Well, Ironclad, you guys are going to have your own beanies that are going to be EMF shields from all the PSYOPs.
Well, I got in
kind
here.
Kind of heavy, full lead.
Here's an EMF bag for at least for your phone, so you can.
There you go. This is it. Let's open this up here. This is your production.
Yeah, you see Sean, who's
cool. It
does
comes
an
with
awesome
a screen.
job on the series. Yeah.
These are some elite gummy bears.
Yeah, man.
I'm taking those home.
Those are part of it.
Yeah, I brought some. Sean, we got to spend a lot of time with him and his crew, and they did an awesome job with the series. But I grabbed a bunch of bag of gummy bears, and I was going to give them to some friends because they're big fans of Sean. And I was like, where did the gummy bears go? Under my daughter's bed, I found.
There's the PSYOP.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Jesse.
She knew.
Thanks, guys.
We'll have you.
Thank you.
We'll have you back and do this again.
Good work. It's a heavy lift. Obviously, we get to dip our toes into producing any kind of long form video content is years and years. So good work on you. And thanks for coming.
Yeah, I appreciate it, guys.
And hopefully our listeners check it out and tell us what they think.
Yeah, awesome.
Also,
hopefully it's good.
Once we wrap this, we're going to critique Nate's hair. It's real long right now.
Yeah.
I like it, man.
A lot of lettuce on this set here.
Let it go. All right.
Cool.
Have a good one.